For quantitative variables, the most popular kind of chart that we can make is called a histogram. Sometimes a more technical name for it is a grouped frequency histogram. And all it is a bar chart. So like we made a bar chart for the eye color, we can make a similar kind of bar chart for numerical data. But there's a catch with the numerical data. So let's take a look at some actual data to see what the catch might be in making a bar chart out of it. Let's pick on age, for example. Delete that. This here. So I just copied the age column from our data from the survey and put it in here. And there's a bunch of different ages there. If you have, again, a column of numerical data, if there's nothing else in the column but that data and some blank cells, then it's safe to highlight the column and then go to insert and drop in a chart. And what usually will happen is the spreadsheet will look at your data and say, let's make a histogram. Now, it won't always do that. Notice this one says histogram of age. We'll explain this in just a minute. Sometimes it might make a straight bar chart out of it. Now, what it does there is it makes a bar for every single age. I think there were 306, 307 ages in here. So that means there's 307 columns. Each height represents the age of somebody. That's a mess. That is not a meaningful chart. Okay? So we never make a bar chart out of straight data where each data value gets its own column. So that's not meaningful. How about a pie chart? What? That's insane. Okay. Pretty, nice piece of art, but it's a meaningless chart. What's about the only meaningful chart you can make with quantitative data? A histogram. So I'm going to adjust this histogram a little bit and then I'll explain it. Now, notice the numbers at the bottom here, 15, 17.65, 20.29. Those are kind of weird numbers. Google has a program in the background that looks at your numbers and decides, okay, what's the smallest number? What's the biggest number? And then it splits up the range from small to big, minimum to maximum, and it counts in groups. So what it's doing, for example, here, this column starts at 17.65 and goes to 20.29. So let me explain that, and then we'll do this better. Screenshotter. Add to current, please. Load this up a bit more. All right, so I just want to pick on this one column. Later, right here. The way it's counting there is it's looking at all the ages. And if an age is between those two values, 17.65 on the low end and 20.29 on the high end. Now notice on one side I have a less than or equal to, on the other side I just have a less than. So what that means, if somebody entered their age as exactly 17.65, it gets put in this column. So the low number, if somebody matches that number, they get put in that column. The high number on the other end is for the next column over. So it stops right before 20.29. And then Google just counts up how many numbers are in that range. Seems pretty straightforward. So I mentioned earlier, we call it a histogram. Technically, it is a grouped frequency histogram because you have to group the numbers, because for most data, you just can't use every single number because there's just too many of them and you get this mess, like that messy chart I had a minute ago, which is not usable, it's not readable, it's not helpful. All right, next thing. Google picked this jump from 15 to 17.65, which is a jump by 2.65, and it kept jumping by 2.65. technically, when you make a histogram, the width of each column has to be the same. And we could double check by doing subtraction, but in this case, by just looking at the first pair there, I can see that the column width that Google picked is 2.65. Why 2.65? I don't know. They have some weird program in the background that guessed at that number. So those numbers are kind of ugly. How do we usually group ages? Well, when I think about ages, I think of teenagers or 20-something people or 30-something. And then my wife would remind me that, well, as far as 20-somethings go, human brains are not fully developed to about 25. So as far as 20-somethings go, there's a big difference between people below 25 and people between 25 and 30. They're slightly different kinds of adults. So maybe we could break them down in groups of 5. So I'm just going to go back to Google and play around. So generally, when you first make a histogram, here's my main point here, right? All you do is highlight the data, say, make me a chart. If Google didn't pick histogram, you go back here and pick histogram. But then there's going to be weird numbers on the bottom, and this is where you have to go in and customize it. To customize a histogram in Google, you need to pick a bucket size. The bucket size is what I identified here in my notes, the column width. So column width is also known as, AKA, bucket size. For this data, Google defaulted to a bucket size of 2.65. I think that kind of sucks. It's not bad. So what I'm going to do instead is, well, let's try a bucket size of 5. Okay, a little cleaner, nicer numbers at the bottom. My mother would like this. So this, again, the first column counts 15 to 20. So if you're 15, you get in that column. If you're 20, you would be in the next column over. Okay. If you're 25, which column would you be in? The second or the third? If you're 25 years old. You'd be in the third column, correct? Yeah. Yeah. So that's the way the chart maker does it. The low number is in the column, the high number is not in the column. Is there a best histogram? Well, a histogram is dependent upon 2 things. It's dependent on your starting value. Google started at counting at 15. Why did it pick 15? I don't know. And the width of the column. Some people like to use, instead of the width of the column as a deciding factor for their histogram, how many columns you should have. And I'll give you a rule about that in just a second. So let's summarize what we got about histograms. New page. Histogram, also known as a grouped frequency histogram, for sure, to make a group frequency histogram, you got to know what's the minimum value in the data set. You need to know what the maximum value is, because that's going to determine the range of numbers you get to work with. So Google had to do that in the background. After that, you need 1 or 2 other decisions to make. So options next. Either you're going to pick the bucket size or group width. So bucket size, also known as the group width. Spelling issues again. Group width. Or you could decide on the number of buckets or columns that you want. And again, these, depending on what software you use to make one of these, sometimes they're called columns, sometimes they're called buckets, sometimes they're called groups, sometimes they're called bins. There's probably another piece of language I forgot about out there. You decide how many you want. Whether you choose to make your histogram based on the width of each group or the number of them, a common rule related to number is you want to have somewhere between 5 and 20. Fewer than 5 looks a little weird, too blocky, and if it's more than 20, it's too hard to read. It's just too much for most of us to wrap our minds around. So generally, I'm going to aim for somewhere around 10-ish, depending on the types of numbers that I'm working with. How many did I end up in this example right here? So in this example, when I switched to a width of 5, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's nice. It's not too many, it's not too few. So I'm just going to steal this here, put it in this example. Is this a good histogram? It's not a bad histogram at this point. Oops. So again, some things about this particular histogram here. Google decided for me with a minimum of 15. And it picked a max that's big enough to hold all of my data. And Google, it picked a bucket size, remember in the previous one, 2.65, which is kind of random. In this case, I'm picking a group width or a bucket size of 5. I thought that looked nicer. Now, often again, when we're talking about ages, we think about teens, 20-somethings, 30-somethings. So what would it look like if we want the bucket size of 10 instead? And again, the spreadsheet gives you a quick way to just mess with it. I can go back into it by hitting that 3-dot button and then editing it. And I want to do customize histogram. I'll write this down in a moment. And I can just go and switch. Now, if you want a width, it doesn't have, like, suppose you're like, I really want a width of 3. You just type 3. So I just clicked on bucket size. If I just type the number 3 and hit enter, it'll rewrite it to show a width of 3, 15, 18, 21, 24. Say, no, 3 doesn't work. I'm going to try 4. Put a 4 in there, hit enter. So it's really easy to mess around and get a slightly different histogram. I want to try 10. Now, the problem with 10 here is it's starting at 15. It's going 15 to 25, 25 to 35. I want to go 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and so on. So I got to figure out how to change the minimum. Notice that isn't in the histogram area here. So I got to scroll on down and edit the horizontal axis. And there I can give it a minimum. I can give it a new one there. Yeah. All right. So now I have people in their teens, people in their 20s, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s. And it looks like it caps out at 60 here. So the maximum must be less than 60, or maybe it is exactly 60. Get rid of the chart editor, screenshot of that. Please. All right, so here's another histogram. Only thing this histogram is missing, 2 things actually. Needs a better title. Histogram of age is pretty lame. And I need to be able to explain what these numbers on the side were. Age is pretty self-explanatory, I think, down here. So a better title here might be number of students. We could call it frequency also of students. And this could just be ages of math students. Since it is just my math students who took the survey. So I have 3 different histograms so far. There were a couple others in between there, which is the best one. They're all okay, except maybe this first one. The random width Google picked of 2.65 is kind of weird. It's most people would be put off by those weird numbers at the bottom, or left wondering, why did you pick those numbers? There must be something important about 2.65 for student ages. It was just random. So you want to make a conscious choice about those right there. All right, so again, this is what's called a histogram. Technically, it's a grouped frequency histogram because there's too many numbers in any given data set to graph every single one of them on its own. So I want to put that in here too as an example. I'm going to go back to my data and I'm going to insert a really bad chart to document what not to do. So insert chart. I'm going to switch that to just a straight bar chart. because I want to make a definite note. Don't do this. Add to page views. This is a bad chart. Don't make a straight bar chart. Of a numerical variable. Don't do that, please. I'm pointing this out specifically because we're going to make some charts for a given data set later for the written assignment. And I usually get several people that show me that chart as their summary of the data, and it's just meaningless. So please, 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 please don't do that. All right, next. Summary statistics.